Hi, my name is Dana Pasquale. I'm a postdoc here at Duke, and I'm going to talk to you about ethics and human subjects considerations for link tracing designs. I'll start by introducing link tracing designs because the background is important to understand the ethics, though I encourage you to watch Ashton Vergery's lecture in the introductory set about respondent-driven sampling. I'll talk about why we use link tracing designs, variations of link tracing designs, ethics, and institutional review boards. And then throughout, I'll use the Duke RDS squared study as an example. So jumping into link tracing designs. Link tracing, which is also called chain referral sampling or snowball sampling, is a peer-to-peer sampling method. So you start with people in the community, you consent and enroll them into the study. And then among other study activities, you ask them to bring in some of their social contacts to join the study as well. So imagine starting with the dark blue nodes and the graphic at the bottom. They might each bring in 3 people for enrollment, who then themselves would be able to recruit their contacts for enrollment. Link tracing is especially effective in cases when you aren't sure who's in the population or risk set. And this is sometimes because the population or the outcome is hidden. Sometimes it's because there's stigma experienced by the population of interest. And so link tracing has been successfully deployed many times among injecting drug users. And then if you've got people who generally don't trust medical research, then link tracing can be helpful because it leverages trust among community co-members from one person to another as they explain the study and recruit their contacts for enrollment. It can also help when the outcome or infection is rare because sometimes there's a community of people who organize around having the condition. Link tracing also protects privacy when it's done correctly. So potential contacts aren't identified by enrolled study participants. Instead, the recruitment is passive with respect to the study, and study members actively recruit contacts who aren't identified ahead of time to the researchers. This also then allows community members to participate as much or as little as they choose. So the assumption is that people know their own networks better than any kind of investigator. So researcher, clinician, or public health professional will. So that's another benefit for using link tracing designs. And then finally, this kind of person-to-person sampling can also approximate infectious processes, which is why this type of sampling is used in contact tracing. So you have contact with people, and if that contact is effective to spread a bug from one person to another, then you'd also want to recruit those contacts that the enrolled person had effective contact with into the study. So starting with a seed case who's in the population of interest, seeds recruit their peers for participation. And this is generally done through passing recruitment coupons to their social contacts. The peers can then choose to consent to participate. Peers who consent are then given their own coupons to solicit their contacts. And each step outward from the peer is called a wave or a generation. In addition to the compensation participants receive for completing study activities, things like study surveys or perhaps tests, those are traditional study activities, participants are also compensated for their recruitment effort. So this is called a dual incentive structure, where the tier of compensation for traditional study activities is called the primary incentive, and then any compensation participants receive for their time and effort towards recruitment is called the secondary incentive. All participants receive primary incentives for completing study activities, and any participants who recruit contacts also receive secondary incentives, and that's separate from being a seed or a peer. Seeds are typically recruited for convenience. So when a population is difficult enough to enroll that a link tracing design is justified, it generally means that you're starting with the seeds that you know. So the seeds are population members who are known to the researchers, to the investigators, and are willing to participate, and ideally also have large personal networks containing more members of the population of interest. The number of coupons per participant, the maximum number, or the range of number, is set during study design. And then non-seeds, the peers, can only participate if they redeem a coupon given to them by an enrolled participant. Coupons are uniquely coded so that when a coupon is redeemed, it can be linked back to the participant who distributed it. And this is an example of what a coupon might look like. This is an older version of the coupon used in the Duke RDS squared study. It is important to note, though, that that study staff handle the informed consent and enrollment and study procedures if peers do present for enrollment. That isn't done by the recruiting participant. So respondent-driven sampling is a set of variations on link tracing designs. So the commonality among the set of variations is the calculation of a probability estimator that allows researchers to weight the sample to then estimate the population of interest. And then, of course, make inferences about the population while also having a sense of how biased the estimates might be. RDS samples do require the number of waves to be sufficiently long or the number of waves to be sufficiently large to reduce bias. And this is because RDS chains generally start out as a convenience sample. So for the variance in an RDS sample to approach the variance, to approach that of a simple random sample, the number of waves or the chain length needs to cross a certain threshold value. And that means that you need to collect more cases than you would for a simple random sample at the outset to achieve a variance which approaches that of a simple random sample. So the multiplier of participants needed is called the design effect. And as you can imagine, it can be expensive and inefficient to get to the desired sample size. So an approach called network sampling with memory is a variation of RDS, which reduces the design effect. So in network sampling with memory, more detailed network data is collected, and then the network through two different methods is used to guide sampling. And this reduces the design effect and thus the sample size needed. So in any link tracing design, there are some potential harms of which to be aware. So first, as with any network collected, the risk of deductive disclosure is higher because more information and more types of information are collected. And then second, this is more complicated because social contacts or peers haven't consented for information about them to be shared. So when done properly, contacts aren't identified to the researchers, and the study participants recruit their contacts who are known only to them. Researchers don't know if coupons were handed out or not, and don't know who might have received a coupon until a coupon holder presents for enrollment and is consented into the study. So the concern about sharing information about people who haven't consented is magnified. If you're studying a hidden population, then that population is likely hidden for a reason. So asking participants to identify other people who might be part of the group but who haven't consented is unethical. So another potential harm to consider is there is a report of where the dual incentive scheme resulted in coercion to participate among injecting drug users. Participants were reportedly coercing the people they distributed coupons to enroll so that they would receive their secondary incentive, their recruitment compensation. And that's the first reference below. However, this report generated substantial controversy. Those are the second through fifth references. That's a selection of them, including notably concerns about a lack of separation of issues caused by the RDS versus any outreach program with injecting drug users. And I encourage you to read these references. So the concerns are real. As you can imagine, institutional review boards do and should look closely at studies employing link tracing designs. So related to the example on the prior slide, compensation amounts need to be carefully considered per study activity, including recruitment, and the study population needs to be considered as well. There are some excellent reviews in the literature, two are cited below, describing compensation amounts used. So it's helpful to know what's worked without causing issues in prior studies that might be in a similar setting or similar population as yours. And like anything else, it's helpful to know what's cited in the literature, and everything needs to be carefully considered and justified. But still, I've seen on several academic institutional review board pages that they explicitly state that they will not approve incentives for participants to recruit their social contacts because of concerns about harm. So related to population, prior work can be helpful as well. So CDC has several guides describing use of RDS in different populations at risk for HIV, and in fact undertakes RDS studies every few years. Researchers should ensure that people who haven't consented are not identifiable to study staff based on what they're collecting in the survey or from enrolled participants. So participant social networks shouldn't be displayed if there's a chance that participants can be identified. There is something called a certificate of confidentiality that can be obtained from different US Department of Health and Human Services agencies. So a COC, a certificate of confidentiality, protects the privacy of research subjects by stating that data collected during the course of the study can't be disclosed for any reason. And this can be extremely helpful and a comfort to participants if you're collecting information among a population that's hidden because their behavior or status is criminalized. So in the COVID study that I'll talk about shortly, we obtained a COC because we wanted to ensure that we protect any undocumented people who enroll, and the COC protects our data from ICE or other agencies. And finally, materials or scripts provided to participants so that they can share study information with their potential contacts, with their potential recruits, need to be approved by the IRB. And then all of this should be part of the protocol and explained in the IRB application. So there are also several suggestions to mitigate harms, which should also be part of study design. First, setting a maximum number of coupons provided to any participant limits the potential compensation for participating in recruitment and is thought to stop participants from potentially coercing their contacts to enroll. Tied to that, the compensation for recruitment, the secondary incentive, should not be high enough to induce coercion. And then third, when coupon holding potential participants do present for consent or enrollment, they should be asked about any social harms they experienced related to recruitment or enrollment. And these can range from peer pressure or coercion to more serious harms such as violence to enroll. So I'm now going to talk about these things using the COVID contact tracing study as an example. So Duke RDS squared is respondent-driven sampling for respiratory disease surveillance, though it actually uses a snowball sampling design to trace active SARS-CoV-2 infections in the county around Durham, around Duke University, that's Durham County. So here we are at Duke in Durham County. It's considered metropolitan and is part of Research Triangle Park, which is the tech hub in North Carolina. There are around 320,000 residents of Durham County. So in a country of around 320 million, it means that approximately every 1 in 1,000 US residents lives in Durham County. And it is an extraordinarily diverse county. So sociodemographically, the majority of residents are non-white. We have a substantial proportion of foreign-born residents, and 1 in 5 do not speak English at home primarily. Among residents aged 25 or older, 1 in 5 have a master's degree or higher, but then 1 in 8 don't have high school equivalency. The average household size is 2.4 people, and just over half of households are occupied by their owners. The majority of houses do have internet, but too many residents live in poverty, and 1 in 8 people in Durham, which is a lot of people, have no health insurance. It's also geographically diverse. So in the county of 320,000 people, approximately around 250,000 live in the city itself. So the southern part of the county is more economically linked to the surrounding counties. The north is more rural, sparser, and tends to have higher incomes by census block. The light blue blocks contain the median income. That's 80 to 100% of the county median, and dark blue is higher than that. And then orange and yellow are below that, and those are the bits. Those bits are actually inside the city boundaries. Not surprisingly, there is racial and ethnic disparity in SARS-CoV-2 cases. So this chart shows the proportion of positive SARS-CoV-2 cases by racial and ethnic groups in any given month, starting with March 2020 last year. It is not scaled to population size. So in the first block, March 2020, the green bar for white people dominates, and that likely reflects who was able to get tested. And then right after that, cases soar among Hispanic and Latinx people, the yellow bars, followed by Black or African American people, and the indigo bars, and then the whites, the green bars, catch back up. These two maps, October 2020 on the left and May 2021 on the right, show that there's a geographic gradient as well that's been distinguishable for most of the epidemic. So the Duke RDS Square study, which we affectionately call Snowball, has several objectives. The goal is to increase efficiency in contact tracing practices. So first and foremost, case ascertainment is an objective, and that's for isolation and interrupting transmission. Then, since we are aware of the principle of homophily, we decided to use a detailed social network survey to try to find active SARS-CoV-2 cases in Durham County. The social network survey asks questions to capture both close contacts, the strong ties for whom, if we have a positive case identified, then we might find someone else in the same transmission chain. So either the person who infected our case or other people that the case might have infected before we were able to trace them. So just like contact tracing. But then we are also asking about weaker or more distal contacts. And then we're furthermore asking about venues frequented, because the idea is that if people cluster by demographics and by behavior, then when one person is infected, it might reflect that the bug is circulating in that person's social network community, where people are similar, they might live in similar places, and they might practice similar mitigating or exacerbating behaviors. So in addition to that, we are conducting sampling for active infection. That means you're currently infected at the time that we sample you, and then also serology testing for antibodies. And then there is a biometric monitoring cohort through smartwatches for a subset of participants to see if it's possible to identify sensitive signals indicating early infection. And the goal is, as much as possible, to achieve a set of participants at the outset that represents the county. So it's because without knowing how insular or connected each network community is, waiting at the back ends might propagate the bias to the results. So assuming that social network communities exist along socio-demographic lines, we're selecting seeds who represent the marginal demographics of Durham County. And then in a link tracing design, researchers generally seed control over sampling as they leave it up to the participants to recruit their peers. And this is one of the reasons why RDS can be weighted at the back end, because an assumption is made, and there are maths to support it, that if the chains become sufficiently long, then you can reduce bias and achieve a somewhat representative set of people. But instead, one of the things that makes this more of a snowball sampling rather than an RDS design is that we are attempting to exert some control over the sampling. And we're doing this by incentivizing people to recruit more distal contacts within the dual incentive structure. So our recommendations don't have to be followed, and participants are still compensated for their part in recruiting peers, but the incentive is a little higher if our recommendations are followed. So in Snowball, seeds will be anyone who was diagnosed with COVID at a Duke University Health System, DUHS site. They have to be residents of Durham County and adults 18 years or older. Peers have to be recruited by a study participant. They have to have a coupon that hasn't previously been redeemed. They have to be adults as well and close enough to Duke University or within the county so that they can be tested. So we, as I said, want to enroll a cohort that represents Durham. So in addition to being very intentional about the seeds being selected, we're recommending, as I said, to seeds which social context to refer. So an assumption of RDS in reducing selection bias is equal homophily, or an equal propensity to form in-group ties. So RDS chains, to meet this assumption, are supposed to be able to cross over any social boundaries. And if there are impassable boundaries, then you have to seed separately across those boundaries. So we are assuming in Snowball that tie crossing is less likely when considering people who primarily speak English versus another language at home. And the second most common language spoken is Spanish in Durham County. So to reduce bias, then we, in an RDS study, you have to stratify recruitment among groups if the equal homophily assumption is violated. So that's what we're doing. We've translated all of our study materials into Spanish, and we are seeding among English and Spanish speaking people separately. So most participants with active SARS-CoV-2 infection will receive 3 to 5 coupons for enrollment. We're also allowing people who might not be positive, but who are part of a high-risk group or a group that we're not enrolling well to receive coupons as well. So additional coupons are provided for some participants anyway. That includes people who are in congregate living settings, people with riskier contact patterns, or people who are part of an underrepresented group in the cohort, or people who might be more infectious at the time that we're sampling them. So to get to the objectives, participants complete a few assessments within a single time point. So they complete a detailed survey. It can be done electronically, as can the consent, but there are also avenues for in-person or telephone consent and survey completion so that we're not excluding anyone. Seeds aren't given any kind of lab test. That's because we already know their SARS-CoV-2 status. They need to be positive to be considered as a seed. Peers are sampled, though. At a single time point, they have 2 nose swabs to determine whether they currently have COVID. And then there's also a blood draw to test for antibodies. And then there's, in addition to that, an option to join the cohort for ongoing biometric monitoring of heart rate, temperature, things like that through a smartwatch. So the ethical considerations. So first, we are not asking specific questions about respondent social networks. We're instead asking things like the number of people encountered on a typical day, or the number of people you know that have been vaccinated, or the number of people you know that have been diagnosed with COVID. And then we can use that to scale up to get a sense of the network size. When contacts are described, we are asking some information about some closer contacts. We only ask first name or initials and relationship type, in addition to some basic demographics. So deductive disclosure is still a risk since we ask information about household composition. So everything is protected within HIPAA compliant systems. We're also taking the steps to protect the privacy of respondents and potential participants. So we don't ask which grocery stores or things like that people specifically go to, only the types of places that they go or the types of activities that they might engage in. We also don't require participants to disclose their COVID status when they recruit contacts. They can just say, I've joined the study, and would you like to join it as well? And then finally, we did obtain a certificate of confidentiality. Of course, even with the COC, we are still mandated to report if we identify any positive COVID cases to the county health department. So the institutional review board did initially decline to approve the dual incentive structure. So we were very intentional when we designed the study, when we selected the compensation amounts for both primary and secondary activities, so the traditional study activities, and then recruitment. But still, understandably, that was something that was initially declined. So we wrote a justification for why we were doing it, including citing the small amounts of compensation that wouldn't be coercive relative to other study procedures, to other studies operating in the community at the same time, other COVID studies, and studies within the specific populations. So given that, and given the need to ensure that we were capturing a representative set of people after a full IRB review, the dual incentive structure was approved. Still, we are really careful about any potential harms that might befall our participants, and are also careful with reporting of infection status by communities. So that is the end of my presentation. With that, thank you all for listening. I'm looking forward to seeing you this week in case you have any questions. And then there's also a list of additional readings too, if anyone is interested on the training website. So thank you all for your time.